Hello everyone, I'm Asha Nayaswami. This is my friend Keshava, and we're continuing with Swami's wonderful book of letters in Divine Friendship. So let's start with a prayer, then we'll do a couple of chants and meditate a few minutes before we start. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Inspire us with your presence. Help us to understand the deeper truths of the divine life, that we may guide our lives in such a way that we find true happiness. Help us to rise above all lesser considerations, that we may live according to Dharma, that our lives be pleasing to our own superconscious self, that we be loyal to our highest ideals, and that at the end of our lives we can say with deep gratitude to God and Guru, thank you for the opportunity to serve, and may we continue to love you for all eternity. Om. Peace. Amen.
If you don't know, tonight is Janmashtami, or the celebration of Krishna's birthday. So I thought we would begin with 2 chants to Krishna.
Let's meditate now for just a couple of minutes. Drawing especially on the blessings of Krishna, since this is his celebration day. Om, peace. Amen. All right, my friends. Here we go. We are on the last letter of the section called Advice and Encouragement, which is the second section of the book. And we started, I got one paragraph into this letter before I had to stop last week. The letter was written in 2001, and someone asked Swami to clarify the nature of consciousness. And so I'm going to read the first paragraph again. I have to say I don't entirely remember what I said the last time, because if you talk as much as I do, if you remember everything you say, you would go completely crazy. So I make it a point of just putting it out of my mind. And so I hope I don't repeat myself. But if I do, you'll have to just put up with it. I'm awfully sorry. You can always sort of skip ahead until you see that I'm saying something new. Anyway, sometimes it comes back to me. When I first started teaching on a different basis, when I started traveling from the village, and at that time we had a center in San Francisco, one in Sacramento, and one in Palo Alto. And for a number of years, frequently during the year, I would go on Monday and I would teach in Sacramento, Tuesday in San Francisco, and Wednesday in Palo Alto, and then come back to the village. And I broke that up with traveling to Portland or Seattle, sometimes Southern California, other places. It's sort of a bit of a blur because it was in the early 80s, in the few years before I moved here. And I remember the first time I realized, I was saying to Swami, because what I would do is I would have a 4-part series. I would use the same advertising for all 3 centers, and I would just go in sequence and do it. But I'm completely extemporaneous, and the vibration of the devotees in Sacramento, San Francisco, and Palo Alto was extremely different. The energy of each city was very, very different. So even when I was talking about exactly the same subject, I would talk about it completely differently because it was just the people in the room. Swamiji has often said when he was speaking that the audience determines the talk much more than he did, because it was what they drew through him. The way I've come to think about it is Divine Mother can hear what people want to hear, so she whispers it to me and then I say it. It's not that I can hear it, but she can hear it, and then she gives me the suggestions. So when the vibrations are so different and the individuals are different, then you say very different things. So I have to do this class in sequence. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, class 1. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, class 2. And when I was just about to start, I said to Swamiji, because he used to do exactly the same thing in 5 different cities. He would give these class series when he was starting Ananda, one after another. He'd travel to 5 different Northern California cities, then go to the village to do weekend retreats, and then come back and start over. I said, how do you keep track of what you've said and where you've said it? Swami said, by being completely conscious when you speak. And of course, my next question was, and like in plan B, if that doesn't really quite work. But fortunately, in that circumstance, I did find that I couldn't remember, by Thursday I couldn't remember, but when I was back in the room on Monday, looking at essentially the same people in the same space, it was like in that vibration, it would come back to me. So it hasn't yet come back to me, what I've said at the beginning of this letter, but maybe it will. I was just telling you that because it's interesting. Swami's, the way he trained us to speak is very, very different. I was in a then traditional ministerial training. I did a retreat once with a group of Episcopal clergymen, and they all talked about how they spend Saturdays writing their sermon. And it was like, it just never. And when I would speak, sometimes even in the unity churches, when they would do 2 services, they would ask me for me to give them my sermon before the first service, because then they would print it out and hand it out after each service. And I had to say, oops, not a chance. And even the first and second service would have completely different sermons, because Divine Mother heard different thoughts in people's minds. And oftentimes after a Sunday service, someone will say, oh, you talked about just what I was thinking. I say, well, thank you for coming so I'd have something to say, because that's really how it is. So coming back to this, Chitta is the feeling aspect of consciousness. It also underlies all consciousness, inasmuch as consciousness is feeling awareness. Now, of course, I remember what we talked about. Therefore, Master wrote in the chapter on cosmic consciousness in Autobiography of a Yogi, I cognize the center of this empyrean as a point of intuitive perception in my heart. So we were talking about feeling and feeling awareness and how that all goes together. I'm not going to repeat it. And then we'll go on with the letter here. Consciousness has various aspects in human manifestation, separated, as you know, so Swami was obviously writing to someone who would know, because most people don't, separated, as you know, into mon, buddhi, ahankar, and chitta. But its all-embracing reality is feeling awareness. Therefore, chitta comes at the end, not so much to sum up as to underline. Now let me just see if he explains this. He does explain it. To sum up suggests separate things being added together. Cosmic chitta is one underlying reality of which mind, which is mon, the human ability to perceive, intellect, which is buddhi, the human ability to discriminate, ahankara, which is ego, the limited human perception of the one infinite self, and chitta, the human manifestation of cosmic feeling which, united to ego, says, I like, I don't like, of which all of these are manifestations. The classic story about mon, buddhi, ahankara, and chitta are this. Mon is just perceives without attaching anything to it. Buddhi divides the world up and sees what things are. Ahankara, ego, it personally identifies with it, and chitta has a feeling about what it's perceiving. So the story that Master always tells is there's a horse, and mon, the mind, just perceives. There it is. There's something moving. It is what it is. You're just looking at this world, and there's all these things that are happening. It doesn't discriminate a horse from a house, from a self, from an automobile. Everything is moving. There's all this field. It's perception. Then buddhi discriminates. Oh, that's a horse. And by defining that as a horse, then everything else is not a horse. And it has its own name, and the automobile is not a horse because it's an automobile, and the automobile is not a dog because that's the dog. And so to function in this world, we have to use buddhi. We have to be able to discriminate. If we're just moving around in a field of energy, we don't know what to do and what not to do. And then comes ahankara, and that's ego. And the ego says, oh, that's my horse. So there's a field of energy. I know it's a horse. And now I am an individual in relation to that horse. That's my horse. And then Master puts in, but even at that point, you're not bound by delusion, because you've seen the field of energy, you've discriminated among the different vibrations of energy, and you know your individual relationship to those different items. It's just a fact. Where bondage comes in was you say, chitta comes in, feeling comes in, and you say, I'm so happy when I see my horse. And that's where bondage takes place. And that's why in yoga we say what we have to overcome is our likes and dislikes. We can still be ourselves. We can still know what is mine and what is not mine. And this is why Swami Kriyananda can say, I don't identify with Kriyananda, which is another way of saying I'm not dependent on Kriyananda. I don't have a lot of feeling opinion about Kriyananda. Kriyananda is an event for which I am responsible. In the great field of life, he perceives that Kriyananda exists, and he perceives that Kriyananda has responsibilities. All of that is fact, but it's totally neutral fact until I'm happy being Kriyananda, I'm proud being Kriyananda. Kriyananda is a burden, just all these different things where the feeling element comes in and is broken into likes and dislikes. That's what he's writing about here. So, the Chitta, human manifestation of cosmic feeling, which, and this is the key, united to ego, says. It's when Chitta gets united to ego that I like and I dislike and bondage ensues. So he says, yes, likes and dislikes, he must be answering a question, yes, likes and dislikes are the most obvious waves of Chitta on a feeling or emotional level. So also are attachments and aversions and a whole gamut of other feelings, most of them related, of course, to the first of these, likes and dislikes. It is in their emotional form that they become binding, and in their emotional form that they become separate and distinct from buddhi, ahankar, etc. Otherwise, as pure Chitta, they underlie and embrace everything. Hence, Master's words, I cognize the center of this empyrean as a point of intuitive perception in my heart. Pure Chitta doesn't divide. It's the human manifestation of Chitta that does. And then Swami says, and I'm saying it to all of us, I hope this clarifies. I hope it does clarify because it's very interesting. And here's where it's relevant. Of course, you may have to open the book yourself to read this. I've spent a very long time trying to understand what I just described to you and really to understand the nature of Chitta. It's subtle, and I'm not really certain that I do. So I'm going to only go as far as my portfolio will allow me to go on this. Pay grade is what they sometimes describe it as. But it's what he's trying to say is that feeling itself is fundamental. And he's answering, this person was probably just saying, have I got this straight? Is this the right way to say it? Who knows who wrote? Swami signs this love, which means it was somebody who was close to him. He was close enough that he could just write as simply as that. So somebody was probably wanting to get their thoughts straight. Many of us who had the responsibility of explaining this to other people would often confirm with Swami, can I say it this way? Is this true? I certainly did that with him many, many times. Much of the time I was able to do it verbally rather than written, but I would sort of get the edge of clarity on something I was trying to understand, and I would present it to Swami just to make sure I hadn't, gone off in some strange thing, and that's what I see someone's trying to do here, wanting to be able to talk about it properly. So he wasn't directly trying to correct a misunderstanding, but it's important to get it clear. Feeling itself does not bind. Feeling itself is just feeling. And that also goes for the feeling of disappointment, the feeling of grief. For example, in 1981, Swami Kriyananda moved away from being a monk, and he formed a partnership with this woman who was called Parameshwari. That was the name she was given. He did it, and I write about it, and I always like to flash this book. I write about it in Light Bearer, because it was a very important part of Ananda's development, because the community was becoming, we were losing touch with the fact that Master wanted us to be able to integrate spiritual life with ordinary life. And we were falling into the idea that in order to be serious spiritually, I had to be a monastic. And even more than that, people were making decisions according to what they felt they should do instead of according to what they felt inside they were being really called to do. In a very real sense, we were losing touch with our own feelings, and we were just imposing ideas upon ourselves. So the monastic order was just getting bigger and bigger, and the householder side was beginning to feel more and more second class. And Swamiji was exceedingly concerned about it, because every direction for Ananda had been set by Swami Kriyananda, and he was a monk. But what needed was an example of spiritual householders. And he was also feeling himself it was time for a change. It's all a very long and extremely interesting story, but not the point of this. I have only a small part I want to say. So Swamiji went to Hawaii with this thought in his mind that a change was needed. He met this woman. He felt an instantaneous spiritual alignment with her, and she with him. And by the time he came back to Ananda a few years later, they were spiritual partners. He publicly announced that he felt he had done what Master had asked him to do as a monk, and he felt deeply guided by Master to move into a householder lifestyle. It was a big deal when it happened. Suffice to say, it was a big deal. And it's very nicely written in 1981 in this book, Light Bearer. So, unfortunately, what happened is Swamiji made a international announcement that he was assuming a new way of life, except communication at that time was all through print media. And so he sent a beautiful article to Yoga Journal, which was the main means of communication with our world. But of course, the deadline was like 2 or 3 months ahead of publication. So by the time the January issue came out with this announcement, the partnership had dissolved because the woman involved, it was too much for her. Swamiji knew he was asking a lot of her to step into such a public role and to be his partner, which was, no small demand of energy. He had been uncertain about her commitment. She had insisted that they publish the article, but by the time it was published, she was gone and never came back. And Swamiji became quite distressed about it. But his distress, and this is why I'm talking about Chitta, this is important. His distress about it was not that he was brokenhearted because she'd abandoned him. I'm sure that wasn't fun, but that wasn't his point. What he was brokenhearted about was that he'd seen this tremendous spiritual potential in her, and she wasn't going to be able to rise to it, and that was grievously sad for him. And the second thing was, he had taken that step because he felt Master had guided him to it. He had prayed extremely deeply, and he shared with us very openly how conflicted it was because it was such an unexpected change in his life. Master himself had made him a monk. How could he cease to be a monk? It was a really big thing, and Swami was very open with the whole world about it. Swami Kriyananda was an event for which he was responsible. And he was extremely concerned that he had misunderstood Master. So he was grieving because something he thought would be very beautiful wasn't going to fulfill itself, and he was very concerned. And he did nothing to stop those feelings. He did nothing to pretend those feelings weren't happening. He did nothing to suppress those feelings. He did nothing to hide from those feelings. Chitta is an aspect of consciousness, and he just let it run through him. And he just behaved as he would behave. He was very withdrawn. He was very private. I mean, he spent a lot of time alone. It was a very tumultuous period for him. But that was the Chitta that was there. So he just let it be. I think some of us as yogis, we're not comfortable with Chitta. We're fine with it as long as it's blissful and uplifting. But when it demands of us that we experience the extraordinarily disappointing nature of human life and our inability to control, the fluctuations of Maya and the necessary moments of profound and sometimes overwhelming doubt even about our own attunement or about what we're doing in this world. We also have to live through that. Chitta that is in the human manifestation of all of these different emotions. It wasn't even a question of likes or dislikes on Swami's part. He wasn't thinking, I want this to happen, I don't want this to happen. He was it wasn't like he wanted something else to happen. He just wanted to do God's will. But he was confused, or he was concerned, is I think the right way. And so he just had to live in that concern until it resolved himself. And he grieved. He grieved because this tremendous spiritual opportunity had been offered. And Swamiji wrote and said many times, he said to her even, I knew what was being asked of you. And I knew it was going to be, a huge challenge for you. But when we accept what God asks of us, he also gives us the energy. This was his hope, to try to stiffen her spine, which none of it ever worked. But what happened was, Swami actually sort of came out of that period rather suddenly, because he had also been guided into that way of life because Ananda itself needed a correction. It needed two kinds of correction. One was, you can be equally deeply dedicated as a married person with children, as a householder. There's nothing inherently more spiritual about being a monk or a nun than there is about being a householder. It's simply how you live it. And Swamiji, accepting the role of householder, had basically given everybody permission. And the other part of it was, Swami explained the whole change that he did on the basis of, I feel guided. I feel in my heart that this is the right thing. And that's how he put it, I feel. And all of a sudden, the whole community, especially those who were a little confused, was able to ask the question, what do I feel? What do I feel guided to do? Because we had fallen into the most common delusion that spiritual people get involved in. What should I do? Well, the most spiritual way to live is to be a monk or a nun, so therefore I'm serious, I should be a monk or nun. And you really cannot join a monastery because you feel you should. Because then you end up in an extremely complicated nightmare of suppression and external prohibitions that are not the spontaneous expression of your own heart. You know, I was part of the monastery when it was small, and those of us who were core to that group, and I don't mean there was never anyone else, it was not because we felt we should be there. It was because everything in us wanted to be there. It was just what we wanted with our lives. We were in love with that lifestyle the same way that people fall in love with something else, and you want to do it. Of course, like everything else, some days you want to do it more than others, but there's still this fundamental wanting. It's not a calculated decision, based on what I should do. And so what happened when Swamiji said, I feel guided, I feel drawn. He just used that word repeatedly. We were also able to say, what do I feel? Not what do I emotionally feel, what do I want, what are my likes and dislikes, but a deep level of what do I feel. So Swamiji realized that he had naturally, as he put it, he had naturally assumed that the partnership would last longer. It never crossed his mind that it would dissolve in half a year or 3/4 of a year. That never crossed his mind. Well, at least he never admitted that it crossed his mind, but he knew that she had doubts, so I have to be honest about it. He naturally assumed it would last longer. But he realized that everything that he'd hoped to have happened from it had happened. So Divine Mother had done what she needed to have done. And if he hadn't taken the action he'd taken, then that much needed shift at Ananda as a whole might never have happened. So, God's ways are not our ways. And as I remember it, he more or less just one morning just walked out and it was his cheerful self again. And he just realized that he had imposed something. He'd made an assumption based on the guidance that he had, but he realized there was no grounds for that assumption, that the relationship would last longer. But that didn't mean that he was wrong to take it. It's just he'd made a wrong assumption. And then from then on, he was just cheerful. And then after he met Rosanna, they got married, and essentially the transformation that started was finished. And it was finished through his marriage to Rosanna. But all of that is about Chitta, is all about feeling, and the tremendous importance that feeling plays on the spiritual path. And feeling is dangerous. It is dangerous because we have lots of feelings, and a lot of them are better than others, and some of them are profoundly misguiding. And I feel can also be, whoa, that's a really dangerous thing to do. But you can't, therefore, avoid the danger by avoiding what I feel, which is what we try to do. This is dangerous, so I won't go there. Ego is dangerous, so I'll just suppress it. Self-expression might become egoic, so I'll never express myself. Feeling might mislead me, so I'm going to suppress all my feelings. No, it doesn't work either. It's not easy. I remember that I was teaching classes on how to know and trust your inner guidance. And it's a very tricky subject, and I'm no, it's a hard subject to teach. That's just what I'll say. And I gave a seminar, and at the end of it, someone came up to me and just lavished praise upon me for the fabulous program that I'd just given, then continued to tell me how much they'd learned and how much it was going to help them. And every single thing they said was really almost exactly opposite of what I had been trying to convey. And I was watching someone about to sail off and fall into a huge heffalump trap of false guidance. And I just thought, I'm never, ever, ever going to deal with this subject again. I refuse. And shortly after, I was on the phone with Swamiji, and we were just talking, and I told him what happened. I said, that's it. It's a very popular class. I'm never going to teach it again, ever, ever. And Swami, very seriously, he said, Asha, it doesn't matter if people misunderstand. He said, developing intuition is one of the most important things you have to do on the spiritual path. And if they can only learn by getting it wrong, well, then that's just what they have to do. He said, you must keep trying. And I mean, I heard him, because it's the same thing. Merely because it's a heffalump trap, which is a reference to Winnie the Pooh, merely because it's a huge hole covered with branches and we're likely to fall into it, doesn't mean that there's another path. We just have to make our way through it. And if we fall into it, fortunately, heffalumps don't eat us alive, because I don't think there is such a thing as a heffalump. But you fall into the hole, you hang out there for a while, and then you crawl out, because you can't get there from here except by that route. So his whole comment all about Chitta is extremely important, and very important for us to integrate sooner or later. So we've now moved in out of advice and encouragement, and we are now in the section of the book called Judgmental Attitudes. I was involved when this book was being written and these categories were being made up. I look at it now and I think, judgmental attitudes? We have a whole section about judgmental attitudes? Oh dear. Okay, let's see what happens next. The first one is called, guess what? On judgmental attitudes. So I guess we'll just start right in. And the second one is about judgmental attitudes. Yeah, I think that's going to go on for a while. So this was written in the mid-1990s. Now here's something interesting. I did notice this earlier. 94, 98, 99. One of them is 77, and then there's two after the 2000s. Okay, what happened in the mid-1990s is that Ananda was subject to this terrible litigation. The litigation started in 1990 and finished in 2001. And we were first attacked by Master's other spiritual organization, and we were under the guise of trademark and copyright. An attempt was made for the plaintiff in that lawsuit to try to maintain a monopoly on Yogananda's teachings. Their reasoning was that Swami was not a true disciple and he was not following the Guru's will. The Guru's will is that there should be only one Yogananda organization, and by definition, the fact that we existed made us acting contrary to God's will. So that was pretty bad, but we won because America is based on religious freedom. So from 1990 to 94, basically every fundamental issue was litigated without a trial by other methods, judicial methods, and the plaintiff had lost basically everything that they were trying to claim, and they actually even lost rights they didn't know were in jeopardy, because what was revealed was that everyone in the world assumed they had an actual legal monopoly on Yogananda's books, on his teachings, on his photographs, and they didn't. They overreached. And in our defense, we uncovered the fact that, in fact, they didn't own all the things that they thought they owned legally. And because of that, nowadays, there are countless Yogananda organizations, and people use all of his resources all the time. And nobody can stop us, which is just terrific. That's what Master would have wanted. But they'd lost all those exclusive rights, and Swami Kriyananda said to our attorney, they've lost all these exclusive rights. What's left? And our lawyer said, there is a legal concept called tarnishment, which is to say, if you can prove that somebody is, I always use the phrase morally reprehensible, but in some way is corrupt. And any association in the mind of the public between you and that morally corrupt entity will tarnish your reputation. Then you can get legal relief to keep that from happening. And of course, the fact that we claim to be disciples of Yogananda and use the same gurus, quoted from the same works, had his photographs up, made an association in the mind of the public between our Yogananda organization and theirs. So they had to prove that we were morally corrupt. So in 1994, and then when our lawyer said that to Swami, Swami said, well, he said, let's get ready for that. And so at the end of 1994, a second lawsuit was filed, which was financed and instigated and energized by the plaintiff, who couldn't get their religious monopoly any other way. It was a completely false accusation of sexual harassment, that Ananda was a sham organization, that we were a cult, guilty of financial abuse and power abuse and sexual abuse and on and on. It went on for 4 years and was finally decided in 1998. We made grievous errors in our defense of that because it was so preposterous that we naively thought that it could never get traction. Oh, did we ever grow up? And that's all also talked about in Light Bearer. However, see, in the middle of this, suddenly there is this huge assault on the integrity primarily of Swami Kriyananda, and people just, and there were all these declarations that were published about all these terrible things that were going on at Ananda, and women claimed to have been mistreated and all of these different things. And they were all extremely well written and extremely designed to be very persuasive. So this huge energy started. And it had already started in 1990, and it just got tremendous force. And so 3 of these letters are about judgment, and all of them, I believe, are about judgment of Kriyananda and Ananda, at least these first 3. So, therefore, I'm just giving you that very long background, because these letters don't make any sense. Or let me phrase it differently. They make a lot more sense when you know it. So the mid-1990s would be right in the middle of this. This is a very long letter, 2-page letter, so I'll just start in and we'll see how far we get. On the path to God, right attitude is the most important thing, not what you do or say, but the attitude you bring to it. This is something Yogananda always emphasized. And now Swami talks about a story in The Path. Mr. Jaycott, in an episode I cited in The Path, stirred up many emotions by the way he defended Master when an unscrupulous member of the SRF Church in Hollywood attempted a takeover. And I believe there was financial impropriety, and there was a members' meeting, and Mr. Jaycott, in the name of being loyal to Master and defending the work, apparently stood up with a tremendous amount of heat, accused people of wrongdoing and demanded, justice, and in fact stopped something from happening that would have been very unfortunate. Master later thanked Mr. Jaycott for having saved the day. After expressing his gratitude, however, he added this gentle admonition: "It is not good, regardless of one's intentions, to create wrong vibrations through anger and harsh words." So apparently Mr. Jaycott let his temper loose and said things that he might have better not said. "The good that you have accomplished would have been greater had you employed peaceful means." I went on in the next paragraph, Swami's writing, to explain, negativity from whatever motive creates its own momentum. Unfortunately, Mr. Jaycott failed, even after Master's admonition, to see the need for curbing righteous anger in a good cause. Thus, he gradually developed a judgmental mood that ultimately separated him from the work. Now that's a very interesting story, isn't it? I mean, there it was, this terrible wrong was about to be done, and Mr. Jaycock stood up and saved the day. But, well, ego got involved, judgmental attitude, lack of charitable compassion for wrongdoers, giving vent to that kind of energy, and the channel is affected by what passes through it. So he had a righteous cause, but he had a wrong attitude in the way he carried it, and that he didn't hear when Master corrected him. If he had heard Master, if he had realized I did the right thing in the wrong way, and had made an effort after that to change his fundamental attitude, then the separation might not have had to happen. But instead, negativity has its own momentum, because it has a feeling to it. You get a feeling of power. It gives you a feeling of power when you get to sort of be better than other people in self-righteousness, and you get on a vibration, and once you're on that vibration, thoughts are universal. And you start looking for other things to judge because of the way it makes you feel. You can't mess around with these things. You can't just sort of, as Ramakrishna used to put it, if you peel onions, your hands will smell like onions, which is very interesting. It really is something. I'll notice sometimes if I've done some cooking and peel onions, like a day later, I'll sort of be doing something and I'll think, onions. And I'll realize, it's still in my hands. I've taken a shower, I maybe even gone swimming, but my hands still smell like onions. You rub it against stainless steel and it goes away. I have a little thing that looks like a bar of soap that's stainless steel, and you do like that and it goes away. You remagnetize your hands in a different way. Negativity goes through you, it stays with you. The inclination stays with you. You have to be very careful. So, going on, Master also said that whatever we criticize in others, we will have to experience personally ourselves, either in this life or in some future incarnation. To judge others is to invite judgment in return, not only from others, but on the part of divine law. And I just want to check. Well, I think it's another. Now, it's important to understand, and this goes back to ahankara, buddhi, to discriminate is not the same as to judge. To discriminate, even to stand up against something, is not the same as to criticize someone for being that way. You can just simply know that this is a wrong action, and somebody has done a wrong action, and it has to be stopped. But your attitude toward that person, it's not judgmental. How dare you? How could you? You call yourself a disciple, and yet you're behaving this way. No. It's just like, no, this is not acceptable. No, this is not Dharma. No, we're not going to allow this to happen. You can be absolutely firm, but you don't have to be angry. Where does angry come from? Thwarted desires. I want reality to be different than it is. I need to expunge you. I need to be powerful over you. You can be absolutely fixed, and you're just discriminating between right and wrong, and you will not move. You will not move. But you don't have to be angry. And you don't have to be judgmental, because if we're judgmental, that means, how could you behave like this? And that means we don't understand how a person could behave that way. And when we don't have compassion for the power of delusion, if we don't have compassion for other people's weaknesses, because how could you behave that way is because I was eaten up by delusion and I didn't understand. It seemed like a good idea to me, so I did it. I didn't know it was wrong. Now, a person can't say that in the moment, but that's what happens. It always seemed like a good idea at the time, or else I wouldn't have done it. Or I'm compelled by some conflicting energies within me that have taken me over. Nobody deliberately does something wrong if they know it's wrong. They always have some reason why they think it's right. And we need to be compassionate, because there but for the grace of God go I. And if we can't be compassionate and understanding, still discriminating, but compassionate and understanding, then we need to develop compassion. And we develop compassion by being caught up in the same waves of energy and realizing that it's just really not so simple, is it? It's just not as easy as we think it is. when we're just standing there from the outside. You know why the masters are so compassionate about everything? Because they've been through it. And this is a tremendously interesting and important thing to realize. And you've heard me say it more than once because it's tremendously important. You know, Master said he remembered all the way back to being a diamond. So he went through as many incarnations as it takes, which who knows how many, from being a diamond to being a self-realized master. And the only way to get from all that delusion to enlightenment was along the path that we're walking. So when he sees us, or Jesus, or Krishna, or Buddha, or Ramakrishna, or Swami Kriyananda, when St. Francis, when any great master looks and sees someone who's in delusion, he understands exactly what we're doing, and he remembers what it felt like, and how, from that particular perspective, with those particular facts, it seems like a good idea. They don't condone it. They don't encourage it. They do everything they can to get us to change, because they also know how much suffering that attitude creates. But they don't judge, because they understand. They don't criticize, and they don't panic at the sight of it. It's like, okay, this is where you are. This is the trouble you're in. This is how you're going to get out of it. And that's quite different than judgment, you see. So Mr. Jacob was correct. He was correct to stand up, but he allowed wrong attitude to creep in, and that attitude had its own momentum. So, this, as Master said, whatever we criticize in others, we will have to experience personally ourselves. It's really a powerful incentive to change our attitude. Then Swami writes, let's see, to judge others is to invite judgment in return. And here he says, not only from others, but on the part of divine law. That's also a kind of a scary thing, isn't it? In other words, we set up a karma that just we have, I think of it like a debt. We set up a debt. This is the straight path of attunement with God. And when we stray off of that, we've pulled it over this way. We've taken what I might call an illicit pleasure in the power of being angry and the power of being self-righteous. But it's not a divine pleasure. We've stolen this pleasure over here, and we have to pay it back. And we have to pay it back because the degree to which we have, created a positive, what we think of as positive, with the wrong energy, we have to give all that energy back. And that's the divine law, because we are always being pulled to the center toward the divine. We pull away, we have to be pulled back. And so divine law will do that. It will just set it up and make it happen. And it may look like it happens because of this action or that action, but one way or another, we're privileged to be able to experience the consequences of our own wrong thinking. So we are privileged then to overcome it. Aren't we lucky? And this is how we can be so happy when God does things to us that we're not enjoying. Because we can be so happy because I'm getting the chance to pay my debt right now. When Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, let's see, two things that happened. He had a stroke, and that stroke greatly inhibited his ability to articulate and to use words. And everything about him was words. And it was taken away from him. And he had what people call a stroke, but he said, I was stroked. I was stroked by my guru. That's how he put it. And he would talk about like his guru stroked him like that. And when his guru stroked him like that, he lost the ability to speak. And that's what it was. And then they did a film about him, and it was called Fierce Grace. Brilliant. Just brilliant use of words. Because it was grace, but it was fierce. And that's the divine law. Somehow, I don't say he was being punished or judgmental. Who knows? I have no idea. I don't know his karma. But something had to be balanced, and divine law balanced it. It was fierce grace that he had to experience. And actually, he did remarkably well. He lived that way for, maybe a decade, maybe longer. He got some of his speech back, but he never came all the way back. But he learned. And why would we not want to learn? We might be afraid to learn, but we would still want to. So then, Swami writes, "Blessed are the merciful," Jesus said, "for they shall receive mercy." Implicit in this statement is its corollary, that the unmerciful shall be treated without mercy. And yet, divine law is merciful in the end, for it teaches and guides us as fast or as slowly as we choose on the pathway to liberation. Judgmental people, however, are not concerned with the transcendence of those they scorn. They want only for those people to be hurt or destroyed. You can see why it doesn't work very well. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. Sorry about that. I had an experience, which I won't go to in great detail, but just to give you a little of it. It happened when I was on vacation and I was trying to learn to scuba dive. And it was my second holiday of scuba diving. And I had learned and been licensed in the first one. But I'd had a little bit of a scary experience at one point, so I remained quite nervous about scuba diving, even though I did it. And so I was coming back and I was going to have to do it again. I was very, very scared. I mean, I was extremely sick to my stomach, scared. And I couldn't sleep because I was so scared. At the same time, I was determined to face it because it was such a terrible fear. I just couldn't give in to it because I knew it was ungrounded. And somewhere in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, I asked Divine Mother, why are you not being nicer to me? Why aren't you comforting me? And a very weird, but I believe absolutely true association came up, which is in that moment of prayer, I remembered this person who lived in our community at that time, who's long since gone away, so you don't have to try to think who it was, those of you who might know, who I wasn't able, I was not attracted to that person. I did not find that person attractive. And I don't mean attractive in a romantic sense like this. They were not an attractive person. They weren't magnetic to me. There was no magnetism. In fact, there was a bit of anti-magnetism. Who knows why? But the person was actually somebody who struggled to live. And so it was somebody that I really should have been compassionate toward, but I wasn't. I had an aversion to them. And Divine Mother said to me, well, he needed mercy and you never gave it to him. So, you need mercy. You're not going to get it either. And then the thought that came to me, I had created a world in which mercy was not offered, but mercy was needed. So I needed it now, but I'd created a world in which it wasn't offered. So there was no way for it to get through, it was very, very interesting. That's also what he's talking about. You know, if we don't offer mercy, we don't have a vibration of mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. And as Swami says, the opposite must be true. You know, that the unmerciful shall be treated without mercy. And I was. And it didn't help. I had to finally go underwater and not drown before the fear really went away. But my goodness, I treated that person differently when I got home. And I have never forgotten the lesson. Every time I've been tempted to give in to that kind of coldness, I remember. By no means have I always been able to master myself, but I remember. You know, that doesn't have to happen to us too often for us to remember. Okay. And this, you know, judgmental people are not concerned with the transcendence of those they scorn. I mean, I'm not thinking about your spiritual welfare when I'm judging you. I'm just wanting you to be crushed. He says hurt or destroyed. We might not be that evil, but we're just trying to expunge them, just trying to get rid of them. We don't even know that they're really there. We're just trying to push them aside. Mr. Jacob was offering all these harsh words and all these condemnation. He wasn't stopping to think about the spiritual future of the people he was talking to. He was just trying to get rid of the sinner along with the sin. And that's not the way Divine Mother treats us. Divine Mother will try to expunge the misunderstanding, but she'll never try to expunge us. Swami said something interesting about Master. He said, even when Master had to correct them very strongly, he said, you always felt encouraged. He said, whenever you feel discouraged by your failings in any way, know that it's not God speaking to you, it's always Satan. Because when God speaks to you, even if He's revealing to you your shortcomings, simultaneously, He brings you revelation and He brings you hope. But Satan tries to take away your hope. That's pretty much the best way to get someone. I mean, the most extreme example of that is suicide. And why does a person commit suicide? Because they've lost hope. And what keeps us going on the spiritual path? Because we have hope. Now, as it happens, my name, Asha, means hope. And I was in a question and answer session, actually in Italy as it happened, and the first question was, what does your name mean? And because I guess they didn't know, so I said hope, very simple. And then a couple of questions later was, can you sum up the whole spiritual path in one word? And I thought that was a fascinating question, and I just pondered it for a moment, and then it was so obvious, hope. Because that is what the spiritual path gives us, isn't it? That's what our relationship with God and Guru gives us. It gives us hope. And that means no matter how bad it gets, whether circumstances get bad, self-concept gets bad, sin and failure gets terrible, as long as we have hope, we persevere. And we should always have hope, because we are manifestations of the divine, and we are loved unconditionally. And no matter how long we wander in delusion, we will not wander forever. We will come back. So there is always hope. Isn't that a wonderful way to think about it? I was so pleased they asked, because I've always liked my name. I like the simplicity, I like the sound and the meaning. But it became even more profound after that question. I felt extremely honored that the question had been asked, and I get to live that. So, good thoughts. So now Swami goes on. Here is how the karmic law works. It is a question of magnetic attraction. Qualities on which you focus in others, you will attract in return. This is what I was saying. You set up a universe in which certain realities exist. Negativity has its own momentum because karma works through the law of magnetism. I'm generating negative thoughts. I create negative magnetism, and more negativity will come to me, either at me or through me. Qualities on which you focus in others, you will attract in return. If you concentrate on goodness, you will attract goodness. But if you concentrate on evil, you cannot but attract evil to yourself. An obsession with the real or imagined impurity of others must, infallibly, in the end, result in your developing the same impurity yourself. It's the law of magnetism. That's why Divine Mother said to me, you created a universe in which mercy does not exist. When mercy is needed, mercy is not forthcoming. So you need mercy, but there's no way it can come to you, because in your universe, it's not there. It's very, very powerful. The point here is not whether your judgment is valid, but only that the judgment itself creates its own magnetism. You might be certain that a reputed saint was actually a sinner. I have to laugh here. I've often said to my friends, oftentimes the test is more subtle because you're right. Your judgment of the person is exactly valid. So-and-so really is a terrible leader, and they really have behaved very, very badly. So, the correction to this is not for you to be able to say, oh, I was wrong, they're really a wonderful person. In fact, they may be absolutely as bad as you think they are. They may even actually be worse. So you can't get out of it just by having your perception changed. You have to change your attitude about your perception. Think about Divine Mother. Oh my, look at this poor soul. He's so misguided. He's going to create so much misery for himself. The mother says, how can I help him? And of course, the way to help him may be to put a stone wall in front of him and make him stop, because he's already done a lot of bad things and we don't want him to do any more. But we're putting that stone wall in front of him and stopping him because it's not good for him to continue. And we want the best for him and for everyone else too. That's quite different than how dare you. This is, you see, the judgment, the difference between judgment and discrimination. We just discriminate, behave appropriately, but we don't have to take it into our own attitude too. You might be certain that a reputed saint was actually a sinner, regardless of the validity of that certainty. If you allowed it to become a vortex of condemnation, It would generate a magnetism that would draw energy inward, eventually in judgment upon yourself. Now, of course, this was what a lot was going on at Ananda. How dare Swami Kriyananda continue in his role as leader? If this has been said and that's been said, and if there's any truth in this, and we must, just all this like this. Even if he's as bad as that, if you start in with this kind of an attitude, then that's the magnetism you'll develop. There's much more that could be said about that, and I think we do a little bit more of it. Does this mean we should blindly ignore evil if we find ourselves exposed to it? Swami says, by no means. To ignore evils that are thrust at us is, if only passively, to endorse them. If you really believe a situation to be seriously wrong, then you owe it to yourself and to those involved to do what you can to improve matters, or else to distance yourself. In other words, not to continue to support what you have decided is unsupportable. In such a case, the important thing would be not to let yourself be drawn into a downward spiral of negativity in yourself. It would be important, in other words, not to react angrily or in other ways disharmoniously. Dharmically, it would be best to uphold before others a higher vision, to invite them to a better way of living or of looking at things. If you found your listeners blind to your good advice, then the only right thing to do, and now he makes it exact, and this is what the letter must have been, then the only right thing to do would be to leave Ananda quietly, blessing all here, even in their ignorance. You've done your best to win people to your point of view, and if you can't win them to it, then just leave quietly, blessing people in their ignorance. To create an emotional stir, even in a spirit of righteousness, would be to involve yourself karmically in the very negativity you condemn, rightly or wrongly, in others. So that was what we're talking about. If I think that you, Kriyananda, are a terrible person and all these accusations are true, we must take Kriyananda down as the leader, which is really what was going on in the community. It was really quite an adventure. The community never split, really. Interestingly, there were many other ashrams that were attacked, but they always divided from the inside. We were attacked from the outside. We were unusual. The other ashrams, and it was a movement at the time to sort of basically bring down yoga in America. And every other ashram that was attacked, which was fundamentally every ashram in America, split in the middle. But Ananda never did. We were attacked from the outside, not from the inside, and there was a whirlwind around the edge. And what it was, and I write about it in my book, every few years as Ananda developed, there would be something that would happen that would increase the magnetism. That would increase the magnetism, and the vortex would spin stronger. And those who were in tune with what was happening would be drawn more strongly inward, and those who weren't would be spun out. So what happened through this whole 12 years, but especially during this period, was that these accusations, all of a sudden, you had to really decide for yourself what you believed. Whether you believe whether you believe Swamiji was a true disciple of Master and had the right to present Master's teachings, and then you had to decide whether or not Ananda was in fact an abusive cult, or whether or not we really were what we purported to be, and whether Swami Kriyananda was a true spiritual person, or whether he was a dictatorial sham. And it was awful. But the core of Ananda, I would just call it the real members of Ananda, actually held firm. But there was a huge kerfuffle that went around on the edge. And the kerfuffle, just the wind blew and the wind blew. And when people would come to me, because I was, of course, in the middle of this, and I think my name after Kriyananda's was the one most mentioned, because I was a big communicator, and so my name came up in various things. So I was in a position to know what was true and what wasn't true. I was never accused of, what was I accused of? I was accused of rationalizing What was I accused of? I don't know exactly, but my name would be in it, you know. Asha was there, Asha introduced me, Asha, you know, took me here, Asha said this to me, that sort of thing. So I knew what was going on. I could speak from my actual experience, but that was incidental. But when people would come to me to try to, you know, talk to me about it, I had a rule, which was a very simple rule. I told people there was a few things that because of attorney-client confidentiality, there were a few things that I couldn't share because you have to keep that intact or else nefarious things happen. But most everything, I never held anything back just because I was afraid they couldn't handle it. I figured if I could handle it, they could handle it. But I never tried to persuade, ever. Because if I could persuade someone, then the next person could also persuade them. And I didn't want anybody to stick with Ananda or stick with Swami because I said so. Because we were under attack. Every single person had to decide for himself what was true. So I would just, you know, sit there. What do you know? What's your experience? And I'd answer every question, and I'd volunteer, and I'd explain, but I wouldn't persuade. Just put facts in front of him. I don't know, what do you think? Because also it was so preposterous. Have I ever struck you as the kind of person who would just allow herself to be dominated and abused? Have you ever met anyone in Ananda who felt like that to you? In all of your experiences with Swamiji, have you ever personally seen him to behave in the way he's being accused of behaving? I mean, just, what do you think? What's the basis of your experience? And, you know, that's, you know, sort of what we had to do at that time. So where am I in all of this? So let me just think whatever it was I wanted to say. To create an emotional stir, even in so that was it. So what would happen was people would feel that they had an obligation to fight against the evil, and even when they would meet with no support, they would still feel the necessity to keep whipping up the energy, which is not a good idea, is what Swami was saying here. It's not a good idea. Now, you know, this was a very specific situation, but it's also true, even if you're fighting a righteous cause, if you fight a cause with anger, I mean, I see that a lot in peace demonstrations or social justice demonstrations or so on like that. What is the root consciousness that's causing the problem? The root consciousness is a lack of respect, a lack of love, a lack of compassion, and even much more deeply, a lack of the feeling that we are all children of God and we are all in this together. So if one goes in to create love, equality, respect, one can be firm in one's position, but if one is not acting according to the ideals that you're trying to establish, vibrations speak stronger than words. And it's very tricky. It's a very tricky business because sometimes you have to be very strong and you have to be absolutely unrelenting in your position. So to be unrelenting, Jesus took a whip and drove the money changers out of the temple. He upset their tables and he drove them out of the temple. Now, a little detail on that, which I found very interesting, was apparently, as I understand it from other sources that I've read, not the Bible, you were required, when you came to the temple there, to make certain offerings, and those certain offerings you had to, you know, animals or this or that. And the temple had its own coin. And so whatever coinage you brought from whatever part of the world you brought, it was not acceptable. You had to change your money. That's why it was called the money changers. And the priests, the corrupt priesthood, took a percentage. What a convenient rule. Your money would not be accepted. Only the temple coin would be accepted, and you didn't get fair exchange for your money. So it was just a business that the priests had set up, because it wasn't about Judaism, because Jesus was also a Jew. It was about a corrupt priesthood. So Jesus was indignant. You have made of my Father's house a house of mercenary exchange. And that's what he was so outraged by, is that they'd made up these rules to line their own pockets. And they were just fleecing the people and calling it religion. So he picked up a whip, and, you know, as the pictures show you, he knocked the tables over, and he chased them out of the temple. I mean, that's not a very nice thing to do. But Jesus loved them. But he had to stop them because what they were doing was wrong. You know, I mean, Martin Luther King in our times and his entire nonviolent way of opposing, Mahatma Gandhi's extraordinary nonviolent way of opposing, I mean, those were stunning examples of being absolutely adamant, absolutely firm in your determination to right or wrong, but to always do it with completely the right attitude. A friend of mine, Naidruva, who was actually the attorney also for all of this litigation that we went through, she's a black woman. She was the first black woman to graduate from Harvard University Law School. So she was notable, and she's just a little older than I. And as soon as she graduated, she went and worked for Martin Luther King. She never went south because they wanted her in the north to work on litigation. And just for fun, I'll just tell you, because it's so fun how interesting God does these things. Naidruva is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And she was instrumental in a certain litigation because that movement was fought from many different angles. And one of the things they did, as she explained it to me later, was they took laws that had been written for one purpose, but they saw how they could be applied to another. And so, and I don't know the details, but this is the general picture. There were a lot of laws governing real estate, but they found a way to turn those so that those same laws would prohibit discrimination on racial grounds, which was not why they were written, but it was a creative application of them. And very interestingly, in our case, because of the first case, which was the religious monopoly case, she was able to think in those terms because they were using all these. They were trying to use laws in a creative way, and she was very skilled in it because she'd been trained through that time with Martin Luther King. Isn't that interesting? She was made ready for it, and of course was instrumental in saving us. She and John Parsons. There's a whole book called Fight for Religious Freedom, which John Parsons wrote. He was our lawyer from beginning to end. It's a wonderful story, and it's very important. It was a very important religious freedom case because all over the United States at that time, Eastern religious groups were getting trademarks and copyrights on universal terms, and the U.S. Trademark and Copyright Office did not know they were universal terms. And that's exactly what was going on, that the term self-realization and the name Paramhansa Yogananda, what did the U.S. Copyright Office know? Somebody files an application, said, I made this up, this is my term. They didn't know. And so we had to dismantle all of that. But we stopped that whole movement, totally stopped it. Our case became landmark law, which shifted that whole possibility. So now, what I was trying to say, which was important, oh yes, when Martin Luther King, because I heard about this from her, she knew much of the inside. And she was telling me about one of the very famous moments in Martin Luther King's. He was very, very strategic. He was brilliant. When they were I was in Selma, and there was this bridge that they had to go across. And the police were at one end. The details were, those of you who know this history better than I, but there was a bridge. The police and their dogs were at one end of it. What ended up happening is this horrible scene of policemen and dogs being inflicted upon these demonstrators was on national television, and it turned the tide. Martin Luther King told those people that when you get to the end of the bridge, kneel down and pray. This is hard for me to say. Because if they were kneeling, they couldn't run away. And he knew that when they were attacked, the human impulse to run away would be almost irresistible. And he knew it. So he told them all to kneel. So it played out exactly as he was divinely guided to know it would. And it was also the right thing for them to do. The right thing for them to do was to show exactly what their intent was. They knelt down to pray so that when the policemen and the dogs came at them, they were already helpless. And they couldn't run away. Just like, when she told me that, I just could, I just couldn't believe it. The courage of it, the absolute courage of it. You see how much more courage that takes, than to arm yourself and fight back? It's like I'm in the hands of God, and I'm here. I'm here with God, and this is what we're going to do. It's just a whole nother order of magnitude, which is why they started a revolution which isn't finished, but he launched it. And those extraordinarily creative people launched it with him. Courageous people launched it with them. Okay. I think there's a few more lines in this letter, but I think that we've already said everything we have to say. So I think I'll end it on this point. God bless you.